Okay, so as I mentioned before, I think the big controversy with evolution has to do with the fact that a lot of times people come into this classroom and they have already, like, they have an existing belief system, and within that framework, the idea that that evolution plays any role in the kinds of things that their existing belief system describes, there's just not room for that. And so what I would like to do is I would like to separate our discussion of evolution from our discussion of whether or not evolution really happened. In other words, what I'd like to do is sort of present our ideas as a framework of things that we can observe and things that we can imagine, so that you could sort of say to yourself, okay, this is how it would work. And if you are, if you're, this is something that you think, okay, yeah, that seemed reasonable, I think that did happen, then that's great. But if what you think is, okay, I see how it would work, but that's not what happened, I'm okay with that too. My job is not to persuade you that one thing or another thing really does explain the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about. I would just like you to see how it could explain it. So you could think about it really as a thought exercise, largely. It's kind of like saying, okay, we know that there's this thing called gravity, and if I let go of this ball, then gravity is gonna like pull the ball down and it's gonna land on the table. We don't really have to think about that too much. But just for fun, what if we tried to construct an explanation that involved like little invisible, massless elves pulling things down with invisible, massless strings? Could we do that? I mean, we probably could. Like, we could probably, like, if you said, okay, well, you throw a ball up, and as soon as you throw it up, an invisible elf appears and it pulls down on a string. But what if you're like in an airplane, and is the invisible elf on the ground, or is it on the floor of the airplane? Well, it's on the floor of the airplane because you fall down to the floor of the airplane. But there's another invisible elf under the airplane that's pulling both of you down. And we could come up with this, craft this explanation for gravity. But I don't think that that's how gravity works, not for a second, but it would be kind of fun. We could play around with it, and we could see, okay, well, how close can we get? Like, we know everything falls at the same rate. Some things are a lot heavier, so do the elves have to pull harder on those things? We could come up with measurements and like put a scale under things and be like, well, it looks like the elf is pulling down on this a lot harder. So we could come up with these explanations that we know are not true, but they work. They would explain what we see, and maybe it would be kind of fun and interesting. We might actually get something useful from that. And that is how I would like to approach evolution. I would like to, rather than trying to convince you that there's something that you need to believe or know, what I'd like you to think of is that regardless of whether you have a belief system that's compatible with this or not, everybody can understand it. Everybody can explain how it would work, and that's where I'd like to go. One of the big pieces here has to do with definitions, and this is where I'm going to be super careful about how I approach this, because one of the things that can happen in any conversation is what's called a semantic argument. A semantic argument is when two people are arguing about something, but they're really just using two different definitions for the same word, right? So, for example, if I were to say I'm a really tall, I could say I'm really tall. How many of you would agree with that statement? Don't say anything, but just like raise your hand. Raise your hand if you would agree that I'm really tall. Okay, that's for those of you who are watching on video. Nobody. Now let me ask you this: if our definition of tall is that I am taller than this counter. I'm not saying that's a good definition, but if we used that definition, that were our working definition, now how many of you would say that I'm tall? Right? So by that definition, I'm tall. By our kind of generally accepted understanding, which for like males in America, usually we start to think of tall as being like 6 feet, kind kind of like standard, right? I'm not tall because I'm less than 6 feet. So the definitions we use for words can sometimes lead to arguments. If one person is thinking, well, tall is anything over 5'6", and one person is thinking tall is anything over 6 feet, then two people can be looking at the same person, and one person might say, well, that person's tall, and the other person might say that person's not tall. Not because they disagree on the height of the person, but because they're not using the same definition. So we have to make sure we're using the same definitions for everything. And you'll see in just a second that the scientific biological definition of evolution is very narrow. It does not mean what most people use that term to mean outside of a biology classroom. Okay? So when we think about biological evolution, and this is where I'm going to ask you to write a few things down. So remember that all organisms in a species have the same genes. We all have the same genes on our chromosomes. Okay, the genes are sort of categories. They're things like eye color, or finger length, or earlobe attachment. We all have the same genes. They're located on the same chromosomes in the exact same spots for all of us. But when we talk about alleles, we're talking about different versions of those genes. So the gene is there for all of us, but in some of us, the version that's there makes our eyes blue, or for some of us it makes our eyes brown, for some of us it makes our eyes green. For the earlobe attachment, we all have a gene somewhere that codes for a protein that kind of contributes, kind of determines whether our earlobes come down and are attached directly to the side of our heads, or whether they come down and go back up and we end up with like a lobe that's not attached. We all have that gene. For some of us, that protein is shaped in such a way that when your ears are growing as a, like in utero, they end up being connected. And for some of us, that protein is shaped in such a way that as our earlobes grow, it ends up being disconnected. We have the same gene, we might have different alleles. So when we look at an entire population, like we could think of this classroom as a population of organisms. We're humans in here, and so we can just look at us. If we were to look at us and say, okay, well, we could figure out what alleles we have for all of our genes, right? Like we could figure out for the eye color genes, how many of us have alleles for blue eyes. We all have 2 chromosomes. So we either will have no alleles for blue eyes, 1 allele for blue eyes, or 2 alleles for blue eyes. The total number of chromosomes in this classroom are twice the number of people. And we can do some simple math with that to come up with something that we call an allele frequency. Okay? An allele frequency tells us out of the number of chromosomes in a population, how many of those chromosomes have a certain allele. So if we looked at all of our chromosomes that have the eye color gene on them, and it turned out that half of them had the blue eye color allele, then the allele frequency for blue eye color would be 50%. In biology, as weird as this sounds, evolution is simply a change in the percentage of chromosomes in a population that have a certain allele. In other words, evolution is defined as the change of allele frequencies in a population. What does that mean? That means in a group of organisms like this one, if the percentage of chromosomes that have that blue eye color allele goes up or goes down over time, then evolution has occurred. Now this is weird because we would never actually look at evolution in this population. We look at evolution in bigger populations. We think about things like births and deaths, but technically we could describe, for example, me leaving this room as evolution of this population. If I walk out the door right now, I'm going to take my 2 blue eye colored alleles with me. I have 100% frequency of blue eye alleles. In the classroom, when I leave, the overall percentage of blue eye colored alleles is going to drop. They're going to become less common when I leave. Because of that, technically there's been evolution. And we don't ever look at that kind of evolution. We don't care about the evolution of individuals in a classroom. But we do look, for example, at evolution of individuals in a breeding population of deer, or mosquitoes, or butterflies, or moths, or turtles, or garter snakes. We do look at evolution of humans on a large scale. Historically, like in the past, the breeding population of humans has been like small villages or towns, like people didn't move around a lot. Now, effectively, we are one big population in a lot of ways. Like we're split up into groups, but we have a global connection that contributes to our human evolution. But humans can evolve as alleles become more or less frequent in the overall human population. We can consider that to be evolution, or even in certain subpopulations. So this definition of evolution is super narrow. There's not really much to it. And what's interesting about this is it's also not particularly controversial. The term evolution is controversial. But for the most part, biological evolution, when we use the real definition as a change in allele frequencies, it's not really controversial. The word is controversial, but this happens, and everybody agrees that this happens. And we'll look at some examples of that today, and then we'll dive in a lot more detail next week. So what this means is that when we talk about evolution, we're talking specifically about the genetic makeup of the population. And we don't need to see, there's a bunch of stuff that we don't need to see in order for evolution to occur. We don't, for example, need to see a new species occur. And we don't need to see any visible changes at all. Potentially, evolution can occur in a population even if you can't see it. We're going to see an example of that momentarily. So what this means is that in our conversations in this classroom, when I use the word evolution, I'm talking about a change in allele frequencies. That's something that can be measured. That's something that can be scientifically verified. When you hear the word evolution, if your thought is, oh, well, that's like new species arising where there weren't new species before, or even specifically, well, chimps turning into humans, first of all, that's not what happened. And second of all, that's not what I mean when I use the term evolution. The term evolution refers specifically to the idea of a change of allele frequencies. One example of something that would be small, that would be invisible, is if there were an allele that caused cell membranes to have a little bit more sulfur atoms in them. Right? There's proteins in cell membranes, proteins can have sulfur. If some particular type of organism, like an ant, has an allele that creates proteins with a little bit more sulfur, and those end up in its cell membranes, we'd never know by looking. We'd never be able to see any difference in the ants that have that or don't have it. We wouldn't be able to look at the ants and be like, oh, that's a new species. They just look the same just as the other ones. But if for some reason that gave them a survival advantage, maybe it allowed the ants, for example, to get more calories, get more effective calories from the food they ate so they could survive on less food, then maybe that allele would become more common over time because it would be a benefit to those ants that had it. So as that allele becomes more common, its frequency would increase in that population and evolution would be occurring. So we could look at a population of ants, not see any difference over maybe years, decades. But if that allele is becoming more frequent, then evolution is occurring. So we're going to talk about some of the implications of evolution, and this is where things get a little bit more controversial, because if we use this definition, this piece of evolution is not particularly controversial. But if we think about, okay, well, what else? What else can we do with this idea of alleles and their frequency changing? Then we can get some really interesting things. So what we do in biology is we say, well, let's just, as a thought exercise, imagine a small change happening that we don't notice, and then another small change happening that we don't notice, and then another one, and then another one, and then another, and another, and another, and another. And biologists have come up with a way that we can use evolution to explain the diversity of every living thing on the planet, all the different kinds of organisms, and all the variety within the different kinds of organisms. We can explain that using evolution, and this is where we're shifting from an observed measurable fact, like allele frequencies can and do change in populations, to, well, could we use that to imagine how we got so many different kinds of species and how individuals in those species of organisms look and behave as differently as they do. And so we can see evolution happening. We can see allele frequencies changing. And this, again, is one of those things where if you think about evolution in terms of the non-biology definition, if your internal working definition of evolution is a new species appearing from nowhere, then no, we don't see that happening all the time. We do not observe new species appearing from nowhere. But if you use the definition that I just gave you, that evolution is a change in allele frequencies, then we see that happen all the time. Allele frequencies are constantly changing in all sorts of populations. We can measure it. There is literally no disagreement about that. And if we then imagine, well, if things change a little bit, maybe not even visibly, in a short amount of time, what if there was a whole bunch of time that went by, and nothing changed visibly here, nothing changed visibly here, and nothing, and nothing, and nothing, and nothing, and nothing, but all those invisible changes over a really long period of time added up to a lot of variation and maybe even entirely new kinds of organisms. So this is the idea that populations of organisms can change a little bit over a short time. And then we can say, well, maybe over long periods of time they change a lot. Maybe even to the point that we have an entirely new species. And that sounds crazy to a lot of people, because it just doesn't make sense. How can you look at something and over time see it's not changing, 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 it's not changing. But then when you go back and you look at where it started and where it ended up, you're like, oh, well, there's a big difference there. But we actually see that all the time, not with evolution, but we see that with the development of animals and plants. So let's take you all, for example. Every single one of you, at some point in the not too distant past, was a crying baby. You were a tiny little infant, and you were crying, and you couldn't move, you couldn't feed yourself, you couldn't communicate at all. Really, the only things you did well were make noise and poop. So I guess that's kind of all you do well now. But for the most part, like your skills at controlling the timing of that have changed. So you're a little bit you're able to be a little bit quieter on demand, and you poop less often anyway than you did when you were a tiny little infant. So when we think about that, it's like, well, how did that happen? If I were to take a picture of a human baby, like my own kids, and I were to take a picture just of their face every single day, from when they were born, the day they were born, until now, no one would be able to distinguish between any two pictures in the series. If I showed you a picture of my son on August 12th, 2011, and a picture on August 13th, 2011, never be able to see the difference. If I showed you a picture of my daughter on May 2nd, 2016, and then I showed you another picture May 3rd, 2016, you'd never be able to say, oh, this is the later picture. She looks the same. We do see differences when people like get a haircut. So you could kind of put that in order, but then even like, so you get a haircut and you can kind of figure out, oh, well, this is where the haircut occurred. But then if I gave you 20 pictures that were taken over the course of like 3 weeks, you would never be able to put them in order, in chronological order. You'd never know without knowing what the date was. They all would look the same. This happened to my kids. This happened to you. This happened to me. Every single day, we stay the same. I look the same today as I did yesterday. You all do too. We all look the same yesterday as we did the day before. We all look the same now as we did last week or even a month ago. Like, there are no differences over time. Yet, nobody would blink an eye if I showed you a picture of a baby and said, hey, this baby grew up to be like my 12-year-old son, or this is a picture of me as a baby. Like, nobody looks at that and thinks, well, that can't happen. And that's the same kind of logic that we think about with evolution. If you have a series of invisible small changes over a very long period of time, they could add up. That is our current proposal for how life arose in all of its diversity and how individual organisms within a species show so much variety. Okay, that's our explanation for it. And again, this is where I don't need or want to try to convince you of anything. I just want you to be able to think about how it could happen, because I think it does. There's a logic to it that I think everybody can follow, and it's kind of fun to think about that. In the same way that it's fun to imagine looking at somebody's picture every single day and not seeing any differences, but over a long period of time you see the differences. And you know, I mean, that would be, I suspect probably, I haven't looked, but I suspect on YouTube or TikTok or somewhere, somebody's done this. Somebody has taken a picture of their child every day for years. And if you were to watch it, and you were to watch it with one picture every like 5 seconds, you'd never notice any differences. If you were to watch it with one picture every 1 second, you probably wouldn't notice any differences. But if you were to watch it sped up enough, what you would see is a little tiny baby turning into like an older individual over the course of just a few seconds. You'd see all those incremental changes add up to something that was visible. Okay, so that's kind of our working theory of how this happened. The kinds of things that we see, we have to be able to explain in terms of allele frequencies. So, and this is something we're going to go into a lot more detail about. I'm not going to have you write anything down now. Basically what it involves is the idea that some things are determined by alleles, and that some alleles are going to become more abundant over time because they make it more likely for an organism to live and reproduce. So if an allele confers a reproductive advantage, then that individual will have more kids. And if that happens, then we would see a allele become more prevalent over time, and we call that descent with modification. So if the horse images here, these are like prehistoric horses, and we could imagine that in this population of prehistoric horse-like creatures, that some of them have alleles that make them a little bit bigger than other horses, and maybe that helps them survive. Maybe it helps them outrun predators. And so they have more babies, and their babies are a little bit bigger because they get the same alleles that the parents had. And over time, the bigger horses are more likely to survive, and over time we end up with modern horses which are much larger than the prehistoric horses were because of that beneficial set of alleles that allowed the organisms that had them to reproduce more because they survived more. That is essentially our model for thinking about how living organisms could evolve over time. We see this happening over relatively short periods of time, and we've seen this happen in many cases. I'm going to show you a couple real quick. The first is something, and you'll see, we're going to look at a video today, you'll see more detail about how this kind of thing happens, but resistance to chemicals is a big one. With insects and viruses and bacteria and other kinds of pathogens or pests, we see this happening over and over and over again. Basically, here's how it works. If you have a group of organisms, some of them, just by chance, are going to be more able to survive a chemical spray or like powder or, you know, any kind of chemical. Those organisms, if you spray the chemical, are more likely to survive if their ability to survive that spray is based on something about their unique genetic makeup. In other words, if it's based on alleles that they have, then their kids will be more likely to also be resistant to those chemicals. This happens all the time. we have populations of bugs, we have populations of bacteria, we have populations of viruses that are able to survive the chemicals that we use to try to kill them because they have evolved. And you'll see some examples of this in the movie. Some of you probably experienced this though. One really common example that people talk about is lice, head lice in humans. So it used to be 50 years ago that if you had head lice, you would go to the store and you'd buy this shampoo and it had a kind of nasty chemical in it. You'd wash your hair and all the lice would die and you'd be good. And what people noticed over the last 50 years is that that is less and less and less effective, to the point where now the majority of lice are resistant to the chemical that they used to use in the 1970s. And in fact, if you get lice, a lot of people don't even bother with the chemicals anymore because they're not effective. If you wash your hair with that chemical, it won't kill the lice. So now, instead of saying, go home and wash your hair with this special shampoo, they give you a comb. And they say, go home and comb your hair and get all the lice out with the comb. Because the chemicals don't work on them anymore. Because they've evolved resistance to that chemical application. And there's a number of other things that pests that have evolved resistance. Agricultural pests. Things like fleas and ticks on cats and dogs, we have problems with those now. Our chemicals used to be much more effective. Bed bugs, which are nasty, nasty things. The chemicals that we used to use to eradicate those don't work as well anymore. And so now a lot of people, if they get bed bugs, they just can't get rid of them. You're just stuck with them. Yeah?
Is dandruff
Dandruff is not caused by a pathogen. Dandruff is just skin that flakes off, so it's not caused by any kind of an organism.
And
It's
can
just
what do you call it, the dandruff in your hair kind of reduce? Because mine reduced a lot when I had longer hair.
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know. Yeah. I think so. Interestingly, so dandruff is almost a byproduct of hygiene in some ways. Like human beings, like with soap and shampoo and stuff are relatively new developments, and so I think probably some of the reason that people get dandruff is because of modern hygiene that like washes away our body's oils and natural moisturizers. But I don't know for sure. But sure, yeah. I mean, you certainly can see changes and stuff like that based on behavior and conditions. Yeah. So this is an example of something we would be able to, we'd be able to observe indirectly, but we can't see the difference between mosquitoes that are resistant to pesticides and mosquitoes that aren't resistant to pesticides. We only know that that's a problem because it used to be that if we applied pesticides, we killed a lot more of them, and now we kill a lot less. So we know that they're evolving resistance. Yeah.
So it's like a bug spray when you're trying to put a bug spray on, you just have the bug say it's just going to come near you.
Yeah, and that I don't know if they've evolved resistance to bug spray because bug spray doesn't kill them. So they don't really have, like, it's not this effect where the chemical would actually kill them. They just don't like the smell. They just avoid it. I would guess that there's been some resistance to bug spray that's evolved, but since it's not killing them, it's not going to work like this. It's going to be more like, well, if you don't mind the bug spray, then you're more likely to get a meal, and if you get a meal, then you're more likely to be able to reproduce. So there still could be evolution happening, but it's not going to be as extreme as this, where there are organisms that are actually dying because they're super sensitive to a particular chemical. Another really commonly discussed example is what we call the peppered moth, and this is an organism that people first noticed this in England, and basically what happened was in England during the early 1800s they started burning a lot of coal, and they just like put it in big furnaces and they had smokestacks, and the coal, the hot air and the soot went up the chimney and then it fell, right? And the soot fell, and around industrial areas where they were burning a lot of coal, everything got covered with coal dust. The trunks of trees turned darker, rocks and buildings turned darker. Everything got darker because it was covered with coal dust all the time. And biologists at the time noticed, hey, there's this organism called the peppered moth, and sometimes it's lighter colored and sometimes it's darker colored. And as the Industrial Revolution in England proceeded over the first 50, 60 years of the 1800s, they noticed, oh wow, I'm seeing less and less of these light colored moths and more of these dark colored moths. And eventually, almost all there was left in the industrial areas were these dark colored moths. And then, in the 1950s, people everywhere in England and in the United States and a lot of other places were like, you know what, I'm sick of coal dust. Let's see if we can do something about this. And they started developing technologies to reduce air pollution, using different kinds of things, like instead of burning coal, burning natural gas, or using hydroelectric power, or installing technological devices like scrubbers in smokestacks so that there wasn't as much coal dust being produced even when they were burning coal. And everything started getting lighter. The trees started getting lighter, the rocks and the buildings, and everything started getting lighter. And then what we noticed is, oh wow, now we're starting to see more of these light colored moths again. This is an example of evolution because the coloration is controlled by a set of alleles. The alleles for the dark color became more common, their frequency increased when the background environment got darker, and the light colored alleles got more common when the light color background became the predominant coloration. And what that tells us is evolution can potentially kind of go back and forth. Like there's no new organism here, and there wasn't even really a significant change over a long period of time. But there was a time during which one set of alleles was more abundant, and now there's a time when the original set of alleles is becoming more abundant again. Yeah?
Is it possible for like one darker butterfly to just pop up again?
Yeah, and we'll talk about how that happens. So yeah, there's a couple of different things that we can think about here. One is that we have this sort of background of alleles, and they're always there, and sometimes we have more of some, and sometimes we have more of others, but none of them ever go away. The other situation we can think about is, how do we get new alleles? And can new alleles ever, like if we get rid of one set of alleles, could they ever show up again? And the answer is yeah, they can.
So are, like, for example, like a butterfly,
Yeah.
the alleles affect like how their wings look, or like
Yeah, yes, so there are some things that are entirely environmental. If you take two people, two humans with the exact same color hair, exact same color, and one of them spends a lot of time in the sun, and one of them doesn't, then the one who spends a lot of time in the sun is likely to end up with lighter colored hair because there's a physical effect from sunlight on hair color. That's not genetic. The difference in coloration is not genetic, it's a difference in environment. But there are lots of differences that are purely genetic, right? And when you look at the difference in hair color in this room, right here, some of you like color your hair or spend more time out in the sun or whatever, but for the most part, like if we were to look at your sort of unaltered natural, like 50-50 outdoors, indoors hair color, they would still all be different. That's genetic. All right, so what I want to just make sure that we are kind of keeping in our focus here is that what we really are trying to do is understand something. So those of you who what I don't want is to have this be a situation where anybody feels like I'm trying to convince you of something that it is not within your framework of belief systems or understanding or spirituality or religion or philosophy or anything. Like, I just want you to understand stuff, but I'm not trying to persuade you of anything. And then I want to really work on the vocabulary, particularly the idea that evolution in biology refers just to a change in allele frequencies, which is very different from how we use the term evolution in newspapers and in magazines and on Facebook and stuff like that. And then we'll talk about how this stuff unfolds. So what we're going to think about is kind of that same idea of looking at an infant and then looking at adult and being able to say, well, how could we have gotten from here to here? we're gonna play the same game, only we're gonna be looking at one species and another species. We're gonna kind of watch how broadly, evolutionary theory can explain variation within a species and the development of new species. And then the last thing that I just wanna bring up, and we'll talk much more about this down the road, but one of the things that I think is kind of fun is to think about rules. So when we think about science, a lot of times people are like, well, science is, we're trying to find the truth. Like science is right and everything else is wrong. And that just simply is not an accurate way of describing it, in my opinion. To me, science has a goal. Science's goal is to explain things that we see in the world in a way that allows us to make predictions. That's it. So we could talk about invisible elves pulling things down with strings if we want to. And if that ends up explaining what we see and allowing us to make predictions, fantastic. Let's use it. It doesn't have to be right for us to be able to use something. Science needs to be useful. And the thing about evolution that makes it work in science is that it follows the rules of science. It explains what we see. It leads us to make testable predictions. That's why we rely on evolution in science. And it's the same reason that we rely on a lot of the other stuff that we use in science. Genetics, for example. We know that the things that we see match up with the predictions that we make by using our understanding of genetics. Could it be wrong? Yeah, actually, we could be all wrong about genetics. Maybe it's laser beams from outer space, and that's why we look different. We can't disprove that, but if we follow the rules of science, we have only one good explanation right now for the diversity of life, and that is that it got here through evolution, through changes in allele frequencies over long periods of time. Right? So that's the framework for what we're going to look at, and then for the rest of the period today, I'm going to show you something that I think you'll find pretty interesting.